And welcome back. We are so privileged to have this final session be about what we've all been talking about. The Reusies, I think, really highlighted to us the number of people who are in a solution space and are risking things, their livelihoods, their savings, their blood, their sweat, their tears, but it's not all gloom and doom because we're together in this. And what this last panel is going to demonstrate is that it requires investors, it requires entrepreneurs, it requires corporations, and it requires each of us as consumers to make better and better choices as we become more informed. So it is my pleasure to open up this session. And by the way, my name's Dr. Priscilla Johnson. I'm interim CEO and Chief Strategy Officer for Upstream. This session is on working together to build a new reuse economy. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Yinka Bode-George. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Yinka Bode-George. I'm the CEO and founder of Sustain Our Future Foundation. Our mission is to transform sustainable development in a manner that maximizes community impact positively and achieves environmental justice. And our main way of doing that is by redistributing profits from sustainable development projects into community impact initiatives, all with a lens of environmental justice. And it's great to be here with you all.
Thank you, Yinka. And next we have Helen Cow. She is our group manager in global reusables at Starbucks.
Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here, and thank you. It's so inspiring to be at the Reusies this year, seeing all the innovators, the cities, the activists, all of the companies working together to build this new reuse world. So Helen Cow, Starbucks, been here for about 11 years, took on a number of different roles across beverage, marketing, digital, store formats, and now reusables. I'm happy to say I've landed in a role that I'm truly passionate about. I love the work. I just love the people. I just love the impact that we're making. And it's something that I'm proud of too, because my 4- and 6-year-old, they can actually articulate what I do, and they're very proud of me. So that's something I love. But on the reusables team at Starbucks, we have a bit of a unique model where we are actually supporting all of our global markets around the world towards the shift towards reusables. But I'll also just give a little context on overall Starbucks Planet Positive goals. So Starbucks by 2030, our goal is to reduce waste, carbon, and water by 50%, and then net zero by 2050. And the way that packaging fits into that is, if you think about waste in particular, packaging is about half of Starbucks waste. And then when you think about that, cups and lids, the whole cup system is really the biggest contributor to packaging. So in order to kind of move the waste target towards the waste target, also reduce carbon and water, we really have to focus on our cup system. So really critical, and it's not just about that compostability and recyclability, but also shifting towards reuse in the future. That's the only way we're gonna get there. So in my role, I sort of do a lot of just orchestration of global activities, trying to help our global markets really align towards similar reuse targets. I advise on strategies, test and learn. We really try to coordinate all of the testing that's happening around the world to create shared learnings that can inform our approach going forward. So thank you again.
Thank you, Helen. And next up, we have Georgia Sherwin. She's the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at Closed Loop Partners. You've probably seen them over and over again here at Circularity. They represent the investor community. Take it away, Georgia.
Thank you. And so happy to be here. I'm feeling very, very energized after the Reusies. That was truly an amazing past hour. So excited to be in this context. And yeah, as said, Closed Loop Partners, we're an investment firm dedicated to investing in solutions in the circular economy across a number of different sectors. So from plastics and packaging, fashion and apparel, food and ag, and supply chain technologies, but always through that circular economy lens. And so when it comes to reuse, We've invested in companies providing reuse solutions. So El Gramo, who you saw presenting one of the awards, is a portfolio company of closed loop partners. And also through our innovation center, we do a lot of work in market to help test, refine, and hone reuse solutions in the field. And so we've worked with Starbucks through our NextGen consortium and a number of other brands and organizations to really help bring reuse to life in the field.
And thank you, Georgia. And you all probably recognize Ashima Sukhdev. Ashima, your T-shirt says Reuse Seattle. And they were, of course, a 2023 Reusies winner. So introduce yourself, Ashima.
Thank you. Feeling great, fresh off the win. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashima Sukhdev. I work with the City of Seattle, Seattle Public Utilities, as our Climate and Circular Economy Policy Advisor. I'm a very proud member of the Reuse Seattle team. We're a small but mighty team. It's an initiative that's led by the city, but really brings together a broad coalition of organizations in the city to help move our city's residents and businesses from single-use food service packaging to reusable food service packaging. Welcome to you all to Seattle. It's been so wonderful to have you all here, and really looking forward to discussing reuse with you all.
Thank you so much, Ashima. So my first question is directed to you, Helen and Georgia. I'm wondering, what do you think it would take to make reusables scale?
Great question. So if we think about moving Starbucks cup system to reuse, just think about this. We have literally 100 million customers going to our stores every single day around the world. We have 85 different markets, as I mentioned. And then we also have 7 billion disposable cups used annually right now. So I think kind of by default, getting to scale means it's just going to take a lot, right? If we're going to get to scale, that's the whole point of what we're doing on this test and learn journey. Over the past couple years, we have conducted, over 30 different pilots around the world in the different areas of reusables. We have 3 programs that we focus on. The first is for hereware, which essentially is reusables for dine-in. That really varies by market. Some markets, are, up to half of their occasions are that sit and stay occasion. And so that is going to be a key program for them to scale reusables. We also have our bring your own cup, which I know most coffee shops do. So we've had that for a couple decades as well. So we really want to drive that consumer behavior. The challenge there is remembering to bring that cup, and also it's got to be clean. But we also try to incentivize that as well. And the most nascent program that we have is our Borrow a Cup program, sometimes also known as Returnable Cup, as we do in Europe. And that is, of course, the newest area, but the biggest opportunity because the vast majority of Starbucks customer occasions are to go. So we really have to figure out how to unlock that system. So I'd say that we are not done with testing yet. And I think someone mentioned earlier, if reuse were easy, we would have already scaled, but it's really challenging. And the whole point of testing is to figure out how to scale. And it's going to be different by market. We call it a bit of a portfolio approach, where different markets, based on the regulations, based on where consumer behavior is at, based on their business model, are going to have to do things a little differently. So we are going to be seeing a bit of a checkerboard approach for Starbucks over the next few years. But the goal is to ultimately converge towards more reuse than single use, and ideally making reuse the default. So what it takes to scale, I think there's 3 key factors that we think about that are really about the experience, the economic model, and the life cycle assessment. So when we think about the experience, we have to think about how we can make reusables not only easy, but also accessible. We have so many customers that we serve. How can we make it just really easy to opt in, really easy to return? And then for our employees, who we call partners, what can we do to make reusables as seamless as possible for operations? I think that there's definitely some challenges there. Reusables, because they are more durable, they are thicker, they're more insulated, they gotta withstand a lot of reuse, are inherently less stackable. They take up more space. And so that's just one example of where there's these bits of tension. And so how can we find solutions to go beyond that? Things like SKU consolidation. Do we really need so many types of lids at Starbucks, for example? We could probably think about ways to consolidate down. Another thought area that we have with operations is just the speed of service, right? And so reusables oftentimes involve some sort of opt-in as well as return component, but we're really trying to test a lot of ways to minimize those steps, make them easier, or even just eliminate those steps altogether. So those are just a bit of that customer and partner operational consideration, and just beyond making it easy and accessible and you know, the functional needs, it's also about driving that consumer behavior change and driving the movement. So that is a whole nother work stream that we have, which is looking through the lens of behavioral science, looking at behavior change principles and how we can embed that in everything that we do. So I know it's a little long-winded, but that's experience. And then we've got economic model and LCA. So of course, as we all know, reuse, it can ultimately save money. But at the outset, there are some upfront costs, higher costs of reusable packaging, and then developing that circularity. So the return network, the washing, the logistics, it all is an added cost in the beginning. And so the challenge is, how can we drive those economies of scale? And then how can we find ways to offset costs? Probably through, you know, using less single use, right? But there's maybe other ways, or are there even upside opportunities? And lastly, I don't need to say much about life cycle assessment. That is the perennial challenge of just how you design that end-to-end value chain for reuse that is optimized for sustainability. And I'll just close out by saying that the challenges that we face with experience, with the business model, with the life cycle assessment, like, those are just the same challenges that any business, large or small, faces. And so that is actually great because it's ripe for collaboration. In Starbucks, we're always looking to connect with innovators, with other businesses, really figure out what we can all do to kind of move forward faster together. Two examples, one, of course, the Next Gen Consortium with closed loop partners, really connecting with a lot of other major global brands, sharing learnings, doing research together, even thinking about piloting things together. And then, of course, we're involved with a lot of other industry associations, things like the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. They have a reuse collaborative where folks meet every single month to talk about reuse, the challenges, and share best practices.
Georgia, I think you can agree with me that Starbucks is really lucky to have Helen. Right, audience? That was a master class. And I'm glad we're recording this, because what you are highlighting is you have your PhD in reusables and the strategy that's needed to go behind it. And investors like you, Georgia, you have to evaluate companies and the companies that you want to invest in. And how do you consider those companies in terms of, and this goes back to the question, of how we're going to get reusables to scale?
It's a great question, and I think Helen did a great summary of it's very complex to reuse as a systems challenge, and so it takes a lot of collaboration. From an investor perspective, obviously our lens is a financial lens as well as a environmental and social lens, and so for us, when it comes to reuse, we're looking at a number of different factors across the board, but firstly, the demand side is going to be really important. So is there evidence from a company of purchase orders in place, or strategic partnerships in place, or service agreements, really just showing a market indicator of positive growth. So that's something that we're always going to be looking at. The other piece is making sure that there's demonstrated proof of concept in the field. So has a company moving from the lab proof of concept to actually in the field showing successes there. And then I think from an investment perspective, we're always looking at teams. So obviously startups are oftentimes very small teams, and so your team is your strength, and we look at team dynamics and other factors of when we're evaluating different companies to invest in. And then I think more broadly, sort of getting reuse mainstream, there's macro factors around policy, for example. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done on thoughtful policy and making sure there's representation at the table, diverse representation from industry, but also NGOs, environmental justice groups, so that we can really move forward on progressive policy that enables the system to grow.
Thank you for that, Georgia. And this leads us to a question for you, Yinka and Ashma. And this is about collaboration. And so we're at the Reusies this year, and we're discovering really that the shift to reusables is really a community-led effort. And I'd like to find out from both of you what lessons that you've learned about these community experiences in deploying a strategy such as reusables. And I'll start with you, Yinka.
So I'll start by first naming the fact that last year was actually the 40th anniversary of Warren County, North Carolina's protest of a landfill that was in proximity to a primarily African American community. That moment is actually cited as the catalyzing moment of our environmental justice broad movement. That was 40 years ago. And what I say is, from waste management's inception, environmental injustice has been a cornerstone, right? So we think about the existence of these sacrifice zones in our management strategies. And what we're doing through reuse and other sustainability strategies is really saying no more of that, right? We cannot have communities burdened by these injustices, just be a part of business as usual. And so when we think about involving community members, we have to do that through that lens of environmental justice. We have to say, as we're building a more sustainable future, we have to undo the legacy of harms and injustices as well, and that can happen simultaneously. So why is this important? Well, yes, it's because it's healing work in a lot of ways, but as well, community members are critical for effective solutions and strategies. It takes the community to co-create these initiatives, and you have to have community buy-in for these strategies to really be realized. And the other thing I will say is community members are critical partners in creating the products and technologies that make reuse possible. We have so many wonderful entrepreneurs who can use support in just getting their enterprises off the ground that can be embedded in their own communities, which better resonates with community members as well, right? If you know someone that's starting a reuse business that's from your same neighborhood or community, I think you're more likely to take on that business. And what's fabulous about our community leaders who are ingrained in the needs of their own communities is they know how to conduct outreach, right? They simultaneously educate their surrounding neighbors to explain why these products are really critical. And I have so many friends that are doing this work, and they're here, they're ready for partnership, and it's really exciting.
Thank you, Yinka. And what you did was you took us on a journey from 40 years ago, Warren County, North Carolina. The community stood up for itself and said, we're a sacrifice zone and this isn't acceptable. And fast forward to Seattle, where you, Ashima, are working at the center of what would be considered a flagship program on reuse. And it couldn't have happened without the community. So could you talk a little bit more first? How long has Reuse Seattle been going on, and how has community engagement been since then?
So Reuse Seattle itself is a relatively new initiative. It's been going on for about 2 or 3 years. But it's really building on decades of work in the Seattle area and the community, by the city, by community members on thoughtful environmental work around recycling and composting and waste prevention. So it's a new initiative, but again, it's building on decades of work. In terms of Reuse Seattle as an initiative, we very early on in this work, there was just broad recognition that this has to be collaborative. There's no point for the city to be just working with individual businesses, checking off the list that, okay, they've moved from single use to reuse. We need to be collaborative in nature, working with everyone from the large stadiums and corporates in our city to the small cafes and business owners to the national reuse service providers to bring them to our cities. So every step we've taken has been with collaboration at its core. In terms of some of the kind of lessons that we've learned through that journey so far, first and foremost, I think it's this is a lot of this is about relationships and building that trust and community. This echoing sort of Yinka's point around this, when we're talking to people about reuse, we need to send trusted messengers to various communities to make sure that it's making sense to those local cafes and restaurants, and they understand the benefits for them. We have spent a lot of time on community outreach, and we have people on the ground that are working with those businesses to make sure that they have a good experience with reuse as well, so that they don't get turned off by the idea as well. I also think we recognize that in order to build this reuse community, there needs to be a lot of give and take. We can't just have high expectations for businesses to make the switch without also offering something up. So we as the city have put forward a rebate program where businesses can apply for a $500 rebate and actually make that transition a lot easier for them. And so we're constantly thinking about what can we offer as the city, how can we make this as easy as possible for our community members and for our businesses.
And thank you for that. Seattle is a great place to live and work and do business for a lot of the reasons that you're describing. And the city took risks to go forward with reuse because, a lot of times you don't have any models to go on, or you have pilots and you want to scale and you're wondering, is this going to work? And when you think about it from a corporate context, I want to get your thoughts on this, Helen and Georgia and Ashma. What risks are associated with doing something that's new?
So many. It's really tough, right? Reuse is very nascent. It is not something that you can research and then just put out in the wild. It actually takes a lot of testing and learning and iterating to get it right, and it takes a lot of time. So I think from Starbucks' perspective, there's probably 3, risk/challenge areas. And one is, of course, always the environmental impact, right? Reuse in theory is great, but reuse in practice is really hard. And to the point of that testing and learning and iterating, you have to actually put something out there to then figure out how to optimize that. And then we know that consumer behavior is in a very early place, and that the results we see today are not necessarily indicative of what we will see 5-10 years from now. But of course, if nobody does anything, what we see today is what we're going to see 5 to 10 years from now. So it's all very interrelated. And so it's that challenge of how do you create something that is desirable, that is feasible, that is viable, and then adding that what is sustainable. It's such a huge challenge because all the factors are interrelated. I think the second area, and I would definitely not call this a risk, it's more just growing pains, is just this landscape of lots of communities, local, state, federal, governments really interested in reuse and starting to develop regulations and mandates for reuse, and that is all a wonderful thing. We welcome it. It also creates a challenge for any sort of business that operates in many places to figure out where is it happening and how does it affect us? How do we interpret the language in this bill? And what should we do? And literally the tracking and just ensuring compliance puts many businesses in a bit of a reactive place, but as it should be, gotta move forward. So I wouldn't call it a risk, of course. It's just a call to action to have more consistency in terms of how reuse is defined, what are the standards for reuse, and also how can we all collectively measure in a similar way. And of course, I know there's lots of folks, probably some in the audience, who are working directly on things like that and influencing policymakers at all levels to create more standardized reuse definitions. And I think the third area, which perhaps is unique to a larger company like Starbucks, is this idea that if there is lots of reuse innovators and companies in the marketplace, the last thing anyone wants is a fractured experience for customers where they're literally lugging reusables around of all different brands and having to find this return bin for this and that for that. So there is for sure that benefit to collaboration and creating some sort of interoperable system. However, there's also that balance of what what is standardized versus what is customized. And I know that's often a debate, a conversation that we have with lots of other companies and cities and et cetera. But I think there's definitely some areas that are very obvious for collaboration, things like building that circular infrastructure in a way that drives those economies of scale. Those things don't exist today. Everybody needs them. Got to get those reusables washed and get back to their location, right? And so that easily should be interoperable. There's other things. For Starbucks, for instance, the cup. The cup is very iconic and also very functional and operational. And so for us, that's probably an area where we would need a little customization and actually have our own cup. And it's not just because it's the Starbucks logo and everything, it's actually because of a lot of the functional characteristics needed. It has to be, insulated from boiling hot beverages. It needs to have build lines for the baristas to make certain drinks. There's just a lot of requirements that require some uniqueness there. So just a little bit of tension there between that standardization and customization.
So I'm hopeful. It sounds like it's coming. We've got the right person doing it in Georgia, right? And Georgia, this question's for you, and it is related to risk. But I'm wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit more about what an investor would look at when they are looking at businesses that are startups in the reuse space, or maybe they're even midway through investment.
Sure. I think I will build on, because it's a very important piece of risk generally around reuse is unintended consequences. And I think it's worth always calling out that phrase a little bit, in that anytime we're transitioning a system, and here we're thinking from linear to circular, anytime you're transitioning to a new system, you run the risk of introducing unintended consequences. And so it's something that at Closed Loop Partners, we're always trying to look through that lens and make sure that we don't do such. We don't want to perpetuate some of the challenges with the current system. And so from a reuse perspective, and we've kind of touched on it briefly already, but return rates are key. And I know we talked about this on Monday too. And so what we don't want is reusables being used as single use, right? They're a lot more energy intensive. There's durable plastic or other materials. And so I think we really, really focus on, we want to see companies where return rates are over 90% at least, so that we don't sort of get unintended consequences. I think another risk area as we transition systems is around policy. So we've seen policy is very effective at behavior change. So in New Jersey, for example, there's been single-use plastic bans, and those have been really effective at decreasing the use of single-use plastic bags. But in addition, we need that complementary customer education, consumer education campaigns, as well as the infrastructure piece too. So we just need to make sure things are working sort of holistically and complementary, and so that there's all those pieces fitting together. It's a bit of a puzzle, and you got to kind of get all the right pieces to create the systems change that we're looking for.
Thank you. And to round things out, Ashima and Yinka.
I'll just build on George's point around the risk around policy, potentially. We definitely see policy in Seattle on the horizon around reusables. But we're trying sort of this tried and tested approach that the city has taken before with things like food scrap collections and single-use bags, where we actually first make sure that we kind of shore up support for the idea, make sure that there's service availability for reuse, make sure that there's infrastructure available for reuse. We then move to this phase, which we're sort of at now, where we're kind of championing the first movers, and really working out the kinks with them on how are they finding this reuse experience? Is it working for businesses? Is it working for businesses of all kinds? And are we doing it in an equitable way as well? And then finally, we move to the phase of moving from voluntary to mandatory. Once we know that the system is working, and we can then start to kind of introduce that policy. So that's certainly a risk that we're cognizant of not introducing policy too quickly, such that the market is just simply not ready for it, and we leave a lot of people behind in that place. One other risk, I think Helen was sort of alluding to this, is that customer or resident experience or community experience. I certainly see a tension sometimes if we're moving very quickly in reuse, and there's a lot of like little bits to work out still. And we want to make sure that residents don't get turned off by the idea of reuse or have like a really negative experience in some way, or it ends up being a really niche idea that is only functioning in specific neighborhoods in Seattle, for example. So we're definitely thinking about that. What is the resident experience of reuse, and how do we make sure we're not scaring anyone away from this idea of reuse, because it really does need to be working in the long term.
And I think what we're learning here, Yinka, is that things are complex when you start to think about deploying reuse, but they're not impossible. Can you talk about risk in the work that you do?
Absolutely. I think when I think about risk in this space, it really centers around equities and potential inequities. This is a huge industry with a huge economic projection. And so we have to interrogate who is receiving the benefits of that and who is potentially receiving the burdens of that. In a lot of communities that could be considered frontline communities to the climate crisis, you'll also see issues of food swamps or food deserts, where the communities also lack access to healthy nutritional food and are burdened by highly processed, highly packaged food products. How are they being involved and engaged in this conversation, right? What are those local entities, how are they being engaged so that we're doing the necessary educations to really transform all of our communities positively? So I think if we don't intentionally center equity, whether that's in policy solutions, product design, we're going to leave a lot of people out of the equation, and so that's a huge, huge risk, and we don't want to do that. So I think really thinking about centering equity ubiquitously, right, and working in collaboration across policy solutions, across product development solutions, across nonprofit community engagement solutions, to make sure that we're all speaking the same language and working together to center equity.
Thank you. And we're coming to an end to this, but we've got a couple more questions for our panelists. One of them really is, I'd like to get from you maybe just a couple of minutes, what your thoughts are of how you envision a new reuse world. Ashima, can we start with you?
Sure. I'll throw out a few favorite words in Reuse Seattle. Integrated, interoperable, standardized. We need reuse systems that are emerging to be interconnected and working together. So that certainly is a big part of our vision of a new reuse world. We also need it to be easy, affordable, accessible, convenient. And so those are words that we're using all the time in the Reuse Seattle team, and we keep coming back to really importantly.
Thank you. We have an excited audience member
I
here.
know. Future generations excited about reuse.
Exactly. Don't worry, baby. We're bringing reuse soon.
I know. We need to work faster. We get it.
I think second everything that Ash just said. So I think the only other statement I would say is just I would love to see reuse be the default and single use be the opt-out. Hopefully doesn't even exist. But I mean, today I'm sure many of us have used reuse systems, and usually you have to opt in, you have to go through lots of different pieces. So I would love reuse to be the default. And then also, again, I think accessibility and inclusivity is going to be key in thinking about, not everyone has smartphones or credit cards. And so there's a lot of solutions that are based on those, and that's, so it's just kind of widening the aperture of what reuse solutions looks like to make sure we do get that future of accessible, inclusive, integrated, and all of the words that Ash mentioned.
So my vision of the new reuse world is really reuse at every corner. It's everywhere you turn. And it's really about everyone banding together to do it together. I love my frameworks, as you can probably tell. But I have this framework where it's sort of like layers of the onion of what if Starbucks were to go alone because we're trying to go fast, and there is actually a possibility we may be kind of one of the only big players in the market trying to scale, right? But then what if we partner within our own network and then add our layers of the onion with other businesses, with other innovators, trying to create an ecosystem? What would that look like? And really 3 key benefits, one being impact. Not only is there more reusable's presence, ubiquity, et cetera, there's also the collective, marketing power of all of these companies driving consumer awareness and preference for reuse, which is going to then accelerate that behavior migration, creating a true movement. And that is only going to help the next 2 areas, which is scale, which is, of course, driving to that economies of scale, the efficiency, getting it broad, and then, of course, efficiency from a sustainability standpoint, just driving down driving up the environmental impact there. And so all of those 3 things working in tandem, and I think similar to Georgia, I definitely have a vision where reuse isn't just an extra, you've got the single use and you've got the reusable, but it truly becomes the default. It's the new normal. And the way that we've been trying to position this internally with our Starbucks leaders is that this is going to become the Starbucks experience. There is really no other experience, so how do we design the reuse experience to be the experience we want it to be?
Go Starbucks.
So I think we're in a sustainability renaissance, which is spurring so many innovations and creativity. So if you're a Beyonce fan, you're very primed for a circular economy. I think my vision is environmental justice is the goal, the result, the outcome. And we're centering the community members who historically have been relegated into positions of marginality and face the burdens of injustices. And what does that look like? It looks like local economies where those same community members are invested in and have enterprises that support this work, but can also plug into global supply chains, right? How do we reimagine partnerships and business as usual to center decentralized strategies and local makers and entrepreneurs? I think the future of reuse, my biggest vision is one that there are no sacrifice zones, there's only liberation zones. And we're doing necessary healing work to transform our world.
That was beautifully said, Yinka. And just to cap everything off, yes, reuse coming. Storefront near you. I just want to acknowledge the very last question is from the brilliant mind of Vanessa Tongson. She's our Chief Marketing Officer, and she loves calls to action. And I'd like to know from each one of the panelists, considering the folks that are here at Circularity, large presence of global brands, retailers, there's NGOs, there's a lot of very influential folks here at Circularity. What would be your call to action for them? And we're also thinking about our audience. What would be their call to action as well? Or the audience, when I say audience, I mean the live stream audience. Ashima?
We have a couple calls to action in Reuse Seattle. The first, if you are a reuse service provider or a reuse infrastructure provider and want to be in Seattle, please do come here. We want you to be successful. So let's start that conversation. 2, if you're a reuse Seattle-based business interested in reuse, we want to help you with that transition, whether you're a large corporate or a small business, reach out to us. Thirdly, as we're building this reuse world, let's please consider standards seriously. We work very closely with PR3. They're developing national standards. That's a critical part of this conversation to make this work. And then to the online audience, as an everyday person walking around your city, wherever you might be, try and engage with reuse wherever you can. A lot of these models are in early stages. They need kind of benevolent users and people that are willing to experiment and provide feedback. So engage wherever you can, and keep working with policymakers and activists to push reuse.
I think that last point is absolutely key. We are in this moment of experimentation, and so the feedback is so necessary, and it really is that when you see it on the ground and you're actually engaging, you are potentially downloading an app or interacting there in the field, it makes such a difference. And so providing feedback to the reuse innovators, I think, is a really important piece. And then I think just on an individual level, if you're working at a company and there's if you're in your cafeteria and there's not reusable packaging, then there are so many solutions that we saw earlier. So call to action would be to go to your employers and make sure that there is reusable packaging in your cafeterias. There shouldn't be any excuses. And then I think depending on where you sit in the reuse ecosystem, I think we've all touched on collaboration is key, and especially on that back end, which Helen, you mentioned, the sort of infrastructure build out, collection, washing, everyone needs that in the reuse system. And so it's great to see companies like Redish, which we saw earlier, where they're washing their own stuff, but they're also washing other third-party innovators in the reuse spaces stuff. So that's, really continue to engage with each other and collaborate across the value chain is going to be really important.
I want to tag on to one thing you just said about asking for your workplaces to implement reusables. I think that applies to any sort of closed environment where there is a higher chance of success for reuse. And I basically have this theory of change where if we can get reuse ubiquitous in these closed environments, that's going to expose hundreds of millions of people to reuse, get them used to the idea, get them used to the behavior, and then going to open environments is only going to be that much more successful. But my calls to action, I think, probably similar, is just the value of collaboration, just reaching out. I know this is such a great conference to make connections, form new relationships. So talk to each other, work together, reach out to us. It's going to kind of take a team to kind of build it all together. And then from a personal standpoint, we all have our own networks. We all have influence. I know most folks here have used a reusable, bottle or whatever during the conference, and how do we continue that behavior and really driving that. And just gotta plug Starbucks for one last time. The bring your own is definitely a key focus for us. And one thing that we're trying to do is get that to all of our ordering channels, which is a big deal because right now, technically, bring your own is only accepted in the cafe. Although many baristas will accept it any other way. It's all great. But our team is working on expanding that to drive-through and the mobile order and pay. And really, you're then going to unlock from 25% of occasions to 100%. So by end of calendar year, getting that out there. And most coffee shops offer discounts for BYO. For Starbucks, it's 10 cents off. Plus, if you're a rewards member, 25 stars. It's a lot. You really don't have to go to Starbucks a lot to get a free drink that way. So I just want to plug that.
So I think what I'll first start saying is lean into a radical imagination, that a different way of doing things is possible. And I think that's for both corporations, but also anyone in the audience. A new and better world is possible, and we can lean into that. I also think leveraging collaboration, as everyone has already said, but really reimagining what conventional collaboration looks like. Who has historically been left out of the rooms and spaces, and who can we bring into the fold to make sure that our strategies are really well-rounded and grounded in what's going on, the realities of the world at the local levels, at the national levels, but centering, again, the frontline communities to the climate crisis. So I think leaning into collaboration and a radical imagination will get us to where we need to go.
Thank you, Yinka. So as we come to an end, I just want to leave you all with something inspirational. This panel, first of all, has been inspirational. So could you give them a round of applause, please? I think we're in very good hands. But there was something very interesting that happened. We're wrapping up Circularity, 3 days of circular bliss. And there was an interesting networking exercise that we had done a couple days ago called Ask Offer. And it was an exercise where all the folks in the room, there was about 250 of them, were asked to ask someone for something that they needed. And then the other person was to offer something, and they did the same. So now here we are with all of these initiatives. We've talked about the risk. We've talked about the nascent nature of some of these things. We're talking about not wanting the communities to fail or people to have a bad experience. And I think that there's a lot of solutions that are in this room. So if you remember the ask offer model, as we go forth, this is not the end, but this is the beginning. Thank you so much for attending.